Welcome to the DEC4 podcast. You can access episodes, companion articles, research notes and links, as well as information about our contributors and supporters at dec4podcast.com. Hope you enjoy the program. Gary, great to see you. I've been very much looking forward to this. A very, very warm welcome back.
Thank you very much, sir. It's good to see you again.
Today's episode is actually inspired by some reviews that you've written on your website, soulrideblog.com, and we're looking in detail at a couple of really significant books on the Beach Boys. The Nearest Faraway Place, Brian Wilson, The Beach Boys, and The Southern California Experience by Timothy White. Also Good Vibrations, My Life as a Beach Boy, written in 2016 by Mike Love with James S. Hirsch. And we're also just going to refer a little bit to I Am Brian Wilson, also 2016, with Ben Greenman, for a couple of little counterpoints and a bit of additional context. Okay, so let's begin with The Nearest Faraway Place. Gary, what set this apart as something special in terms of a rock and roll biography?
The research. I think I really tried to punch it up in my review that Timothy White went above and beyond. His research was staggering, and I think that you can do research just for the sake of research, but it served to promote his overall theme of the book, which was much to do with the westward migration of people from the Middle West, Kansas in particular, the Wilson clan. So some of the historical research that he did was quite remarkable. And like I say, it really, the whole book, the point of the whole book, I mean, it called for this type of research because he was talking about an American experience seen through the lens of the Wilson family and the Beach Boys band. So that's what made it different for me. And the many, many peripheral things that he touched on that were players in the Beach Boys orbit during their run in the 60s. The title says it all, The California Experience. I think that the entire Southern California thing in the 60s was captured magnificently by White, and his research really helped set the table in the early pages for his story going forward. Quite remarkable.
One of the things that I found actually quite fascinating from your review was sort of the analysis of the Murry Wilson factor. And there's a couple of just fascinating quotes here. You mentioned these in the review. Murray's inability to see the boys' success through their excited eyes sabotaged many of the professional glories he had once assured the boys they would find so gratifying when they achieved popular recognition. And there's another really telling quote here about, in terms of the Wilson family, the legacy of pain. So can you perhaps take us through a little bit, because it's also mention of Murray's own father?
Well, one thing that's fascinated me in my adventures in the vintage leisure world is the painful sort of realization that there are so many generational things, negative things that are handed down to sons and to children. And when you think about the way people were raised in the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century, once you dig into that a little bit, you realize it's a wonder that anybody turned out normal. I mean, there are a lot of harsh realities of life from the way people were forced to live in the 1800s with a lot of lack, and then moving up through the Depression era. The children of parents of the Depression, it's hard to get your head around what they went through. Love in the home and hugging and happiness and joy. You can't be too surprised to hear that perhaps it was a rarity. So Timothy White, once he researches Murray's lineage, it's there in obvious terms that down through the years, happiness and joy and contentment in life was going to be hard to come by, because hard to break that cycle. So once he discovered Murray's father's issues and the family issues, the drama that was involved with people even leaving Kansas from the get-go, and abandonment issues, and the wives that were made to suffer train travel and living on beaches in tents. And so Murray is a man that finds himself with 3 sons. I mean, the idea that he is going to be gentle and caring is just out the window. The legacy of pain thing just nails it perfectly, because that's what it is. I mean, I was pleased that he wasn't afraid to mention some positive things about Murray, but the deal was in that quote that you referenced, the first one, it was going to be almost impossible for them to be content, for them to look around in the first blushes of success and say, dang, everything is perfect, let's sit back and enjoy this. No, discontent, unfortunately, ran through the family, starting with even before Murray. Like, he's quite a villainous figure, but we have to consider where he came from and what tools he was given to be a father and a loving husband and a man. It was going to be a tough slog, and it's borne out through the lives of his sons.
It's interesting when you look at some of Brian Wilson's commentary on his father, and certainly in places Brian seems to be a little softer and more sympathetic in print than during interviews. In an interview in the David Leaf documentary Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile, Brian described his father as hostile, messed up, and with a lot of hatred. He also said that he was and I'm paraphrasing, but he was so traumatized by being beaten up, he virtually used to cringe around the playground at school, expecting that someone was going to hit him, which is quite awful to contemplate. But as you mentioned in your review as well, Timothy White did mention some of Murray's good work in terms of promoting the band and getting it all together. Yes. But it must have been an incredibly difficult situation. David Marks, for instance, in an interview, recalled his father actually breaking up a full-on fist fight between Murray and Dennis when Dennis was a teenager. So, yeah, it's just quite incredible to think about what sort of domestic environment that must have been.
Yeah, and it's too easy, the same actually with Colonel Tom Parker, it's too easy to get the broad brush stroke out and say there's too much evidence. Murray was a monster, Murray wrecked this and Murray wrecked that. But what that is unrealistic. That's not real life. I mean, Murray was a human being, a man, a father. He had been a son. So there was I'm sure a lot of things and a lot of hard work that he did that were positive. And I like to think there was love somewhere in Murray for his children. But again, like I say, that era and being raised in the era that he was raised in, it wasn't going to be a big demonstrative, let's hug this out sort of environment. So, but there's a balance you have to strike. And Brian, it's interesting, I Just Wasn't Made for These Time documentary, Brian gets into detail describing even the sounds Murray would make when he was disciplining the children. A real serious grunting, whipping machine Murray turned into. So
yes, that's right.
Is that the only thing about Murray? No, there was other things. So Brian is gentle in some aspects when he talks, and I never forget seeing in an American Band, the press conference after Dennis died. Brian was there and he references his father dying 10 years previous. And he even mentions, I read in a book, I think, that my father dying has made me become a man. And he reassessed his father. And of course, once your father dies, you look at things a little bit differently. And there's always the connection that a child is going to have for a parent, no matter what the parent's like. So there's a reality and truth that Brian often talks about. My dad beat us. He was really angry and filled with rage. And that's true. But there are going to be other times when Brian says, yeah, but, my dad, I've even heard Dennis saying in the early days, he worked hard for us. He was, the kids, think about how young they were. They had to have somebody looking out for them. And that was Murray. So it bears much discussion. It's funny, his record was called The Many Moods of Murry Wilson. There's a lot of side to Murray, and it bears discussion, and it's interesting. And he's not to be discarded as just a monster, that's for sure.
So just referring to I Am Brian Wilson, there's just a couple of little interesting passages in this. A few months after we fired my dad, this is Brian speaking obviously, he sent me a long letter. It was 8 pages, typed on Sea of Tunes stationery. First, I tried to teach all of you never to be greedy or dishonest with anyone, be generous with each other. If ever anyone approached any of my children with pills, bennies, or dope, to run away from them, not just walk. Thirdly, you're all told that if anything ever happened to me, that I hope you would take care of your mother. This is where it gets a little interesting. I can remember giving all 3 of my sons love in many forms. Actually, when I was strict from time to time, it was because I felt it was my duty as a father to give you the security a punishment gives. As boys grow into the adolescent time of life, their brain tells them when they have done something wrong, and believe it or not, children are sometimes disappointed when they're not punished because their brain tells them right from wrong. Now, it also appears at this time the marriage wasn't particularly happy. This is a little instructive. Brian says, he talked a little bit about his troubles with my mother and how they were falling out of love. She didn't go against his authority, he said, but she had a look of resentment, and it appears that he might have been a little bit jealous of the sons and how much love was lavished on Brian, Dennis, and Carl by Audrey. He really, I don't think, had a great deal of faith in the future of the Beach Boys. He seemed to think it was all a fad that was going to pass. And, of course, we know he sold the publishing, and that became a big bone of contention with Mike Love, who we're going to talk about afterwards. So what do you make of some of those sentiments?
I think it's sad. I think there's the perils of rock and roll decadence that, to coin a phrase that you hear about so often, it's dangerous enough, that world. But when you add a family situation, there's so much more that gets thrown in the mix. And again, the generational things that happened. So in the midst of trying to make music, in the midst of the heavy competition of the mid-60s rock and roll world, you have a father, an old school type father who sees things a certain way and wants the music to be a certain way, treble up. The fact that Murry is at the board with producers and engineers boggles the mind, because Murry is not skilled in these things, but Murry is sticking his fingers in and instructing the boys. So it must have been terribly restrictive for the guys, especially when they went on tour and he had the rules and the $50 if you swear or something. Young guys are going to bristle at that. And then the only thing they could do was fire him. And of course, once you make such a drastic thing and you see Murry begin to sort of withdraw, well, then you start feeling a little bit bad. There's a sentiment. There's the times when he was a good dad and he did good things. There's so much conflict going on with this band and with this family. It's a wonder that and the discipline thing is interesting. I mean, we can talk about discipline in this day and age. The thinking is that, you let your kids do basically whatever they want. But back in the day, it could be very instructive. I mean, discipline. Some people took it to extremes and it was damaging to kids. And that's the danger, of course. But, people like, you hear about Bing Crosby, his famous parenting methods, again, generational. They were raised with, you are severe with your kids to keep them on the right path. But, that can be very damaging. So there's so many things with this band, never mind the rock and roll world and the business of competing. There's the family things that are going on and these kids that have been together since 12, 13 years old. Again, it's one of those things that's a wonder that the Beach Boys enjoyed the success they did and weren't all out of their minds early on, because there was so much really against them. So many challenges, obstacles, and roadblocks, things to navigate, Must have been really challenging.
So what did we learn from the Nearest Faraway Place about California in the 60s, in those days of the music and ascent of the Beach Boys?
Well, interesting. I remember Kerouac saying it was the fantastic end of America. Wherever you lived in the States, if you went westward, that was your destination. So I love how White builds his book around the westward migration and the Southern California area, the weather he talks about a lot, just the whole land of promise that it was. The Beach Boys, a thing that was really interesting to me was the concept, the idea that music could be made in your garage. Music could be made by a family. The business at the time was maybe more New York-based, Brill building. We write the song here, we arrange it, we send out the demo. It's all very meticulously handled by quote-unquote professional people, business people in suits in the buildings with an eye to a buck and with the eye to fads and all that. But here comes, first of all, Ricky Nelson. It was interesting to hear White pinpoint Ricky Nelson being the spearhead of the whole, right from Hollywood High. Sure, he had the pedigree of his family, but he plugged in, covered a couple of songs, and had hit after hit after hit. And then the interesting Phil Spector aspect where he begins to build his own empire and do it himself, hire local people, and it's grassroots stuff. And then he hits on Jan and Dean, the tape recorder in the garage thing. Jan and Dean did that themselves too, even before the Beach Boys began to do it. So the Beach Boys, the famous story about converting the garage into the music room and Brian experimenting with his tape recorder. You know, the family goes away for the weekend and the boys hang out and they make music. And this whole idea that White puts forward that this started the new thing, the California sound, but also the California business, the idea that you could make it yourself, shop it around, and have a hit. The whole Phil Spector, Beach Boys, Jan and Dean thing was fascinating, and it made me consider, that's interesting that the business began to pivot, and this whole California sound and scene began to emerge, and the Beach Boys were there right at the beginning of it. I thought that was fascinating.
Where does Nearest Faraway Place take us in the story of the Beach Boys?
Most of it is based on business and fracturing and lawyers and suing. Music-wise, everything is basically covered. Dennis's death and the way the band got trying to operate as a cohesive unit, whereas they were all looking elsewhere and wanting to do something else. He's able to describe their legacy, which hasn't really changed since the book was written. It's maybe only gotten bigger and grander because we're hitting like 60 years now this year. Not this year, but for a lot of the hits and the beginnings of their recordings, we're at least on 60 years now. So it's shining brighter today. But the book is pretty good in terms of, and I think I made mention in the review of Stephen Gaines' book, Heroes and Villains, having been my only other really real resource. And Timothy White's book even is able to tack on a half a dozen more years there. So in terms of will I get the whole story? Pretty much, yes. But you will notice reading the book that he's not, yes, he focuses on the Beach Boys and the music business, but he's concerned with so many other things. The Beach Boys and their music is the river that runs through it, but he puts so many things around it that aren't really peripheral. They are part of what the story that he is telling. So in terms of, closure or the final acts of their careers, yes, there is more to learn and to know in what happened afterwards. But White's book is current enough that you do get some pretty good insight about where they left off around 1990.
Timothy White himself, sadly, no longer with us, but he had his background as a music writer. How much do we know about him as a writer?
He was Rolling Stone and Billboard. He was an editor at both publications. So for music, what other magazines do you have to write for? I mean, his rep was quite huge, and he was known at the time for a Bob Marley book that he wrote called Catch a Fire. So he had a pretty big rep in the business. And again, being an editor for those two magazines, he would have his finger on the pulse. And he uses a lot of his own interviews with the Beach Boys. I think there was one, it might have been for Rolling Stone in about 76. And he quotes from it a lot. And you can tell that he is sitting there in the studio witnessing the dynamic between Brian and his brothers and Mike and making mention of it. So he is able to draw on his own work, which is really an interesting part. But yeah, I looked it up. Heart attack at 50. I mean, that's terrible. So he's quite an authority, and he had his finger on the pulse. So that part is excellent because his pedigree is unimpeachable.
Let us now move on to Mike Love's 2016 autobiography, Good Vibrations, My Life as a Beach Boy, written with James S. Hirsch. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book, though, Gary, can you relate to us your personal Mike Love experience backstage?
Well, it was, I put the date. I'm pretty sure it was 90 or 91, 92 perhaps. The Beach Boys were appearing at Canada's Wonderland, a big theme park here in southern Ontario. And they had a concert venue there, and there was $7 concerts. Once you bought admission to the park, which, we used to joke, it's like $50 to get into the park, you could go to the concert for $7. And the Beach Boys were there. It was open air and it was fun. There was a grassy section, so there was beach balls and there was partying, and it was a great atmosphere for the Beach Boys. The first year I went with a friend of mine and we saw them. They actually had a matinee type show, 1 o'clock-ish, and then a more 5 or 6, 7 o'clock show. It worked out so perfectly because we went with my friend's older sister and her husband, and we had tickets for the 1 o'clock show, and they had tickets for the later show. So it was perfect because we were going to get there and first thing go see the Beach Boys, and then we were going to kill some time at the park while they saw their show. So we walk into the park, we walk right in to see the Beach Boys. It was a good show. It was people that know the Beach Boys in this era. It was still pretty good. Carl Wilson was still around, and so it was not a bad show. It hadn't descended yet to what, and sadly, it is today, and for the past 10 years or so.
I did love. How did you describe them in your review with your picture? I did love that. Mike Love and the exclusive license holders.
You know what? I went back and read that, and I shouldn't say this, but yeah, I chuckled. It was pretty good.
I did laugh. That was brilliant. I did love that. Anyway, sorry. Please go on.
Thank you. So. We saw the show. It was great. We're hanging out afterwards, and I remember there's that game with a bunch of like 2-liter pop bottles, and you throw rings in the bottles to win stuff. But the way they rook, the rings are so small, you can't win anything. But anyways, right in this section, we see Al Jardine walking by. And I said to my buddy, I said, am I blind or is that Al Jardine? It's funny when you see somebody over the years in so many different places and ways, to see them in person, you're thrown off, but you're thinking, I'm telling you, that's Al Jardine. So he went in through a gate, which was obviously a gated, fenced-off area, and I guess it was, again, this concert venue was open air, so it was, the backstage area is also open air, grassy hills, and I guess the groundskeepers kept their equipment there, lawnmowers or whatever. I look at him and he looks at me, and when you're young, you know what, you're invincible and nothing can ever happen to you, so you figure, he just walked in this gate. Guess what we should do? Let's just walk in the gate. So we walked in the gate, and we walked along a path, and we walked by a guy that was looking at his lawnmower, and he looked at us, and we looked at him, and he's not tackling us, so this is going to be easy. We end up in an area where there's buildings and there's people milling about, and I'm looking at people and I'm thinking, man, they don't look any different than us. I don't see any. And one kid that was playing there happened to turn around, and yes, he did have a lanyard around his neck with a poster size backstage pass sort of thing. And so I said to my buddy, well, we don't have that, so we do look a little bit out of sorts here. So we saw a group of girls sitting on a hillside, and we said, do you have a pen we can borrow? Because we want to get some autographs. And they said, sure. And eventually we see the big man himself, Mike Love, walk out, and he was surrounded by the girls that danced in the show, and he seemed like, looking back, I don't know that he was intoxicated or not. I know he's not really much of a drinker, really. He seemed kind of mellow and older, and we were a little bit effervescent at the time, and we were asking him if he could sign I don't even know what we had for him to sign. And we said to him, oh, yeah, we snuck backstage. We're not even supposed to be here. We're really adventuring here. And as he was signing, he said, you bastards. And we sort of chuckled, thinking, okay, Mike is kind of cool with this. And one of the girls said, hey, I'm security. And I looked at her, and she had like a bikini on. I said, like, well, you're security. Where do you keep your gun? And she sort of chuckled. And so I patted him on the shoulder area. Yeah. And there was, I don't know, it seemed like it was wetsuit material underneath his Hawaiian shirt. It was something he was wearing underneath. And I thought that was really interesting. So Mike was Mike, but to me, the best thing was Carl Wilson. Carl was just standing there, and you know how he used to wear the suit with a shirt but with no tie?
Yeah.
And he was standing there talking to one person, and Carl had these brown leather slippers on with the fur around the back. He was really chill looking, and he was very gentle, and I handed him my ticket stub, and he signed it on the back, right on this green Holiday Inn ad or whatever. And there was a white strip at the bottom, and I thought, well, what a perfect place to put your signature. He signed it on the green where I couldn't really see it, so I said, would you mind just signing it there on the white strip? So he gave me another one, and that was great. I asked him how Brian was, and at the time, I mean, what's Carl Wilson going to tell me about what's going on? But he just said, he just gave me a nice generic gentle answer. Carl, he seemed exactly like he's always depicted, just a nice, wow, gentle, a gentleman, a nice man. He said, he's doing fine, and we're going to be doing this together or whatever. Just a real pat answer, which was fine. Al Jardine was hustling by with one of his, well, I shouldn't say one of his wives, with his wife at the time. And he was signing something for me. And I said, man, you know what? I've seen footage of you signing people's arms in Prague. You're sitting in the back of the car or something and signing people's arms. And he looked at me weird. And he said, wow, you have footage of that? Where did you see that? And his wife kind of rolled her eyes and she said, it's in that An American Band documentary. Like, that's where he's seen it. And I said, yeah. He said, oh, okay. And this made me think of these superstars. We know them from all these things. They just know their career and their life. Oh, that's right. My only regret is Bruce Johnston was walking by with a surly, mean look on his face. And he looked like he had somewhere to go. He was walking quickly. And I didn't approach him. I thought, there's one that I've missed. I mean, there's even the Bruce Johnston is one of the few guys in the Beach Boys who had something outside of the Beach Boys. And, with his Grammy win and whatnot. So I would have liked to have had that and just to have thanked him for Disney Girls. But I was intimidated. So eventually, we didn't know if we were going to get thrown out or not, but we ended up just running. And some people were starting to look at us then, but we were done. It's funny that we had seen the show already. We got our autographs. We were laughing at this point. I don't care what they do to us. They can throw us out of the park. Like, I'll sit on the curb. So it was quite remarkable. And I was happy to share it with Facebook groups and all that. But of course, with the internet, so many people have had instances like this where they've been backstage or whatever. So everybody has stories, but I like mine. I think it's kind of cool. And to have stood next to Carl Wilson, I don't know. I kind of like that. It was quite an experience.
Yeah, that really is a wonderful, wonderful story. And it always strikes me about Carl in that now that we have all these bootlegs that we can listen to on YouTube and things like that from all of these concerts through the 80s and the 90s with various slight changes in lineup when one particular member wouldn't be there, it always struck me that the one person they could not do without is Carl. You know, a Beach Boys concert without Carl. I mean, I think it might be one of the 4th of July concerts where Brian is actually singing lead, and he sort of tries. Without Carl, it's not quite the same, is it?
You know, to digress a little bit, Carl Wilson, you learn afterwards when you read things, okay, he kept the music together. They could have walked out stage and played a record and people would go crazy, but you still want to put forth a decent show. And I remember, I think it was the summer of 92, they came back to the same venue for about 4 or 5 years. I saw them every year. I was happy, but you could tell a bit of a progression as they went. The year the Good Vibrations box set came out, I believe it's 92. The summer of that show, they were playing different songs from their catalog deeper because, helping to promote the box set. And I remember Carl stood at a keyboard and sang and played All This Is That. And I think I was close enough where I was surprised at the song and I gestured in a way and he sort of nodded at me. And I joked with my buddy. He remembers me from that year signing my autograph. I mean, he didn't, but it was funny. The keyboard wasn't fastened properly and it was bouncing and a roadie came up and sort of fastened it down. So after Carl had died, you could see, okay, now not only is there no Wilsons on the stage, but something is different here. And of course, articles will bear that out. You learn that Carl was that sort of adhesive. And when it's Mike's band, it's a different thing. So Carl Wilson, what a guy, I tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get on to Mike Love's autobiography. I know Mike is a polarising figure for all kinds of reasons. Can you perhaps run us through what the thrust of the book is? I mean, it's sort of a bit of an exercise potentially in self-justification, but if this is actually a phrase, I know justified self-justification, I would think. But can you sort of run us through your impressions of Mike Love's book?
No, I think you nail it. I think that is the thrust of the book. I even make a mention in the review. It seems like he's quoting that documentary we talked about, An American Band. So many things that Mike says, I said to myself, I know the first place I heard that was that documentary. So in a way, it made me think the story of the Beach Boys that Mike presents is fairly, I don't know if you say generic, especially interesting coming from the guy at the middle of it. It reads like a journalist just put together the facts about the band. So in a way, it's very plain, sort of. And I remember about a big hunk of the way into the book, I thought, well, this is almost kind of bland. But to get to your point, he really digs in deep when it comes to the word you just made up is perfect, because it is about, let me set this record straight. And right away, almost every page I came away with, you know what? I believe it. I understand. Who knows the Brian and Dr. Landy era, what happened with the finances of the actual publishing of these songs, I can totally believe that Mike's name was left off some of them. Now, why or how that happened? See, Mike sometimes says, I was robbed because Brian or Murray or the two of them in cahoots robbed me. I don't think it's that black and white. Who knows? The fact remains that I don't think any of us fans deny that Mike was the lyricist. He wrote these words. And I made a point that let's keep it in perspective. She cruised to the hamburger stand now. I mean, those are perfect words for summertime. Don't get me wrong. And I don't need too much depth in my lyrics, but we're not talking Bob Dylan or Springsteen level lyricism here. So let's dial it back a bit, Mike. The deal is, here's my description of the court cases, of what happened, of how even Brian was saying, well, yes, of course, Mike added lyrics. So it's so tangled up, the ways and things that ended up with Mike being not justified as a writer of these songs. And then he likes to describe exactly how this was rectified. So the thrust of the book is, here's my side of the story about how I wrote these songs. The rest of it is, we might want to get into it a bit later, but the formula, his defense of the idea that he never said that the Beach Boys shouldn't fool, I'm paraphrasing, with the formula is a fascinating aspect of it too that I'd like to get into if you'd allow me.
Yeah, of course. In an interview that Mike gave with the Wall Street Journal, which is available online, and we'll link to that in our newsletter. But yes, he does blame Murray particularly for essentially swindling him out of the publishing, and says that his family was a blue-collar family. They were successful in their right, but they were a blue-collar family that really didn't understand the mechanics of music publishing. He suggested that Brian really wanted to give him the credit, but at that point obviously wouldn't stand up to Murray, and then later was incapable of standing up to Murray because obviously Brian did have his sort of mental health and drug issues. So, Mike was quite clear about that in the interview.
So Brian was in a conservatorship. It happened to be administered by an attorney. The attorney thought that too much time had passed, therefore I didn't have any standing to go back and rectify. Even forgetting right or wrong or what was ethical or not, it's irrelevant to many of the people in the law industry. So even though my cousin wanted to rectify it, he couldn't. And so my only recourse was to go to court to establish my authorship of 35 songs. Actually, I wrote several more with my cousin Brian, but 35, including Help Me Rhonda, I Get Around, California Girls, and several others.
It's clear that Mike had an eye on the business side of things. But is that such a bad thing? Because if you don't have a commercially viable touring band and recording band that supports, a lot of families and crew and lavish lifestyles, then the creativity is going to dry up because it's not going to be financially viable. You just wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, I think the two need to live side by side. And has Mike been perhaps a little unfairly demonised for keeping an eye on the commercial aspect?
A lot of us fans, we can get into this a nice meadow with flowers in a world where let the artist go, let him express himself. But if there's not business mechanisms behind that, I can sit in my basement and make beautiful music, but ain't nobody going to hear it unless there's something business in the background driving this. And even Mike mentions in his book, I didn't make a note of it, but something that propped up into my head after I wrote my review was, he said, music can be commercially successful with no art involved, but I don't see a lot of art being successful and out amongst the world if there's not some sort of commerce or business involved. It's a necessary evil. It is called show business. There's so much bean counting and money involved that I think, to your point, you can't just be an artist who is loved the world over and is known the world over if there's not something driving it financially or more realistic in terms of will the people relate to this. So there has to be the two of them together. But I wonder if the Beach Boys were not the perfect symbol of that, because they had one of the premier artists who who poured his heart out on record for the world to hear in Brian Wilson. And the two of them together, I mean, the Beach Boys are maybe the biggest American band ever. They probably are. And one of the biggest, most successful and revered institutions in music history. Maybe a lot of it is because they had those two things working in cahoots. And in general, it is a business, like we say.
If you'd like to expand a little bit on the formula.
Fascinating. This part, Mike, when I started reading the book, I thought, I wonder if I should keep some notes. Is this going to be something I'm going to talk about? And like I say, the first maybe 50, 60 pages, I thought nothing. But then Mike started lobbing up these sliders hanging over the plate that I could just drill over the fence. I'm thinking he gave me too much stuff to work with. And so much of it has to do with the formula. You talk about defending himself. He liked to say, oh, dang, I never said don't F with the formula. The Beach Boys, we never even had a formula. He has the sack to say at one point in his book, we never had a formula. Mike, you're losing any credibility. Don't talk so stupid. If anything, why do we love the Beach Boys? It's that Southern California vibe they had. They invented the California sound, whether or not it's the 70s when it's not about surfing, but there's still that warm weather vibe. Yes, you had a formula. Okay, formula the word has a dirty connotation, but he was able to lob me up some easy ones that I could make a note of. And I got it's quite a list he's given me. He talks about it was me that got together with Brian in 68 to write Do It Again, a great song that was a hit for us. It was top 20 or whatever. And that was me, and he's punching up that he did this. So let's talk about Do It Again. First of all, the title says, let us repeat what we've done before. Okay? The song talks about reminiscing about surfing, and it's almost like a song that is saying to the music buying public, remember us, we're the Beach Boys surfing. So right off the bat, he's tapped back into the formula. Then he says he was in cahoots with Capitol Records a lot, dealing with their compilations and stuff and whatnot, which you could even say makes him a little bit evil, because we could argue in a separate podcast that the compilations throughout the years, the best ofs, are what killed the Beach Boys going forward. But he went to Capitol. He likes to claim that it was him that said, let's call it Endless Summer, the wonderful compilation album we all love from 74. That was actually number one 2 consecutive summers, which is remarkable. Okay, the title itself, Endless Summer. The summer songs will never end. Okay, then he talks about I got together when we were making 15 big ones, and me and Brian got together and we wrote together It's Okay, which is funny, another wonderful song, one of my favorite Beach Boys songs. What is it about the song? Well, fun is in, it's no sin. So we're back now to tapping into, okay, not the formula, but the thing that they always sang about, which is a formula. Then he goes and makes his own record, which we can talk about, Looking Back with Love. In the late 70s, he had to have his own solo album, and he toured, I don't know if he toured exactly, but he played in front of crowds with his band. Now, Mike Love is Mike Love. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, fine. Does he have to give his backing band a name? No, he doesn't have to call them anything, but he does. And what does he call them? The Endless Summer Beach Band. Why? Because the summer songs on the beach will never end. It's not the formula. It's just I'm using the same words from Surfin' from 61. Like, it's the same. Kokomo was mine as well, Mike says. You know what? I'm almost embarrassed. Another song I really like. Why? Because it captures that thing, the Beach Boy thing. Mike says in his book, I thought it was so clever. The mood of the song plus the lyrics, he said, uses the travelogue approach that we'd often use in the past. So approach, maybe he had written the word formula, but crossed it out and used approach. They're interchangeable there. And, Kokomo taps into the Beach Boy formula. Okay, George, we're not even done yet. Then he says, I got an idea. Let's make it a record with a computer, and we'll call it Summer in Paradise, which is, again, another podcast. We can talk about the much maligned Summer in Paradise. The only record basically from the whole canon that was Mike's his own record that he was in control of. What is the name of the record? Summer in Paradise. Do they cover any of their old songs from surfing days? Sure they do. I like it in a way because it's more adult beach songs, but it's still beach songs. It's about summer. It's about living life in the warm weather. So you might as well call that a formula. Capitol hooked up with me again. We have a compilation in 2003. What should we call it, Mike? Mike says, I thought we should call it The Sounds of Summer. He said, why? Because, quote, it's a continuation of the motif. He said approach and motif at different times throughout the book. All these words mean formula. So there's at least 7 examples through the career that he claims as his own things that he did to promote the Beach Boys, to keep them going through compilations and touring or whatever. And each time, what has he done? He's gone back to Surfin' Safari. Brian's Back, the song that they wrote during the 15 Big Ones sessions to promote Brian being back with the band. Look at the lyrics. He references about half a dozen Beach Boys song titles in the lyrics. So Mike has spent his life harvesting and bringing up the fact that it's about the beach. It's the Beach Boys. Now that is a formula. Maybe us fans, we want to cut everybody some slack. We don't want the Beach Boys to be the Beach Boys. It's all about surfing because we know it's about much more than that. But Mike cannot stand there. He should have maybe defended it a different way. Sure, own it, claim it. The Beach Boys are about fun in the sun. Don't you love that? Yes, we do. All of us love it. There'll always be a market for Beach Boy music because it's about escape and the joy of life. Punch that up. He says, we don't have a formula. He actually said that. That, to me, denies the band's very existence and what we love about them. He should have owned it and said, yes, and haven't I been good at this all through the years? Spinning the summer motif, writing lyrics about cruising down the highway? That's what we love, Mike. So just say, this is us. Take it or leave it. He knows that millions are going to take it because he's still touring. I had to keep making notes. Mike, you do have a formula, but that's okay. Own it. So that was the one thing that I don't know if he called that a failure, but it was just a head shaker. Mike, don't spin it that way. You can't spin it that way. You shouldn't spin it that way. The Beach Boys are about fun in the sun with so much more stuff that we love. You know what I mean?
One thing that's interesting too, that I always find, is just how there can be totally different accounts of the same event. And you alluded to Kokomo before. I've seen interviews where Brian Wilson has said, I wasn't even invited to do Kokomo.
Right.
Mike Love says, no, Brian was invited, but Eugene Landy, who was his psychiatrist, wanted to insert himself into the middle of the creative process and get songwriting credits and all this sort of stuff. So nothing came of it. So two totally different perspectives there. Also looking at when they did the 2012 reunion, that was a massive success. Brian wanted to, the chance came for more shows over and above what was initially planned. The version through Brian that he alludes to in I Am Brian Wilson, Mike sort of became a bit difficult, didn't want to do any more, wanted to go back to the exclusive license holders and do his own thing. Mike says, no, that's not the case. What actually happened was there was a pre-agreement for a certain number of shows. Further arrangements were made by Brian and I think Melinda, Brian's wife, to do, probably primarily by Melinda and the management team there, to do more shows without consulting Mike. And I'm sure these are probably just two isolated examples of the fact that there are two totally separate opinions, both of which are probably right, about these sort of contentious events and issues.
And ultimately, at the end of it all, the tour, they said, I fired Brian and Al. That is not true. I didn't fire anybody. We had a contracted, agreed upon amount of shows we did. We finished it, and it was incumbent upon me to go back and do what I have been doing, which is touring as the Beach Boys for many years. So there was some unfairness there and outright inaccuracies.
Yeah, the Kokomo thing, as soon as you insert Dr. Eugene Landy, I can believe almost anything. Like Mike saying, we invited Brian, but Landy put the kibosh on it. See, I can believe that. I can believe that 100%. And if you look at Brian's autobiography, I guess we can call it, Wouldn't It Be Nice? The book that Landy basically wrote, he makes much of the fact that Kokomo happened at the exact same time that Brian was releasing his first solo album. There was a conflict there that a lot of it is suggested Brian's solo album was unsuccessful, mostly because there was competing Beach Boys product out there. The Kokomo thing was, yes, there was no Brian at all, but you know what? It was a massive song, and it's not a bad song. I mean, quite often you'll hear people say that it's Carl with his vocal part in the song that is just it's almost hard to imagine a man of his age at the time. But anyway, wonderful Kokomo. But the Eugene Landy thing, all bets are off. And Brian's solo album is another story as well. With the reunion, if we're going to say that Mike is commerce, Mike is all about making money and being the front man, something that he basically invented, by the way. We have to give him a bit of credit there, too. You think Brian was going to prance around in a turban like Mike would do on the stage? And no, you needed Mike Love for that. Even Carl. Look at Carl and Al on stage. Like, nothing. So Mike, again, is maybe essential for that reason. But they cannot miss the chance to mark this anniversary. And it's a huge one. Only the Rolling Stones. I mean, this band's going on forever. So that's great. The appeal of the record is so the Brian parts of it. The second half of the record is quite stunning, and the ending of it is really quite good. But most of that is Brian. So I've struggled. Mike says in his book, the general consensus is that Brian Wilson walks on water and I'm the Antichrist, he says at one point in his book. If that's the case, the 50th anniversary, I really have to get back together with this guy who my whole legacy as a singer is eclipsed by my cousin Brian. Now I have to join together with him again. So first of all, he'd like to say, you know what, forget that. Then he thinks of the money to be made and the whole prestige factor of the project. So of course Mike is going to be involved. Once that's done and dusted, does Mike want to carry on and do this anymore? I could see there's no way he'd want that. From a business standpoint, I could see him wanting to go back to this lucrative job he has with Bruce of going around with whoever he's got in his band and going back to that life, being who he is, Mike Love, the front man, the legend. Nobody turning to talk to Brian now. Nobody asking Brian. Brian. To me, it was only going to be a one-off. So now you throw Melinda into the mix and Brian's handlers, quote unquote. Poor Brian. It makes me wonder if the man has made any of his own decisions over the past 50 years. I don't know. It's possible that he's pliable enough, needs somebody to steer him, and has been lucky enough, I guess, that it's been a wife the past 30 years, whatever it is. I can see a lot of business getting in the way. And to me, that was never going to be anything other than a one-off. Different sides of the story, but I think you've nailed it. Probably they're all true. It's all true. There's so much of an entanglement that it's hard to get the right story on things like this.
And, Mike has frequently said, look, if it wasn't for all these other complications, if it was just myself and Brian in a room with a piano, then, we're off to the races. But obviously we can't talk about the Beach Boys in this context without bringing up the Charles Manson elephant in the room. And we are actually going to do that in our little end segment after the credits, talk about what Mike Love has said about Charles Manson, about Dennis Wilson. So just to bring us to a conclusion on Mike's book, I just have a couple of points that I'd like your opinion on. One, if Mike's book was actually written as an authorised biography rather than essentially an autobiography with a co-writer, what we refer to as not as a criticism, but a justified thing. Would the self-justification carry more resonance? And finally, is the big problem for many people with Mike Love, he's reached a grand old age, he's wealthy and successful, he's got his life together, certainly by appearance, he's done very, very well. And the reason I mention that is because there's an interesting quote by Una Chaplin, the wife of Charlie Chaplin, was quoted when she was asked why was there this negativity about Charles Chaplin in his own country, England. And she said, well, no one will forgive him for living to a grand old age, being content and happy and living in Switzerland. If he died penniless and drunk in a sort of a bleak, gloomy attic somewhere, everyone would have loved him. And I wonder if there is some of that syndrome with Mike.
Wow, that's some good stuff there. And I'm gobsmacked by the idea that somebody not named Mike Love would write a book about Mike Love.
What?
That idea fascinates me. I might have to pause a second. What journalist, who would say, dang, I have to defend Mike Love. I don't know, Mike or one of his kids, if his mother was still alive, she would maybe write. But all through history and entertainment business, my side of the story, I must write a book. I can't begrudge Mike that. And I mean, when you read through his book, I kept thinking, this is honest talk. I feel like there was nothing, aside from the silly formula thing that he brought up, there's nothing that I thought, I don't think that's true. I don't, that doesn't jibe with what I thought it was pretty an honest book, but you could tell that the meat of it was, hey, don't get me wrong, I wrote these lyrics and it's right and it's fair that now I'm seeing money from this. This has been fixed. This is my side of the story. So the self-justification thing was not just the theme, I think it was the purpose of the book, really. There was a nice payday involved, I'm sure, as well. But I cannot begrudge Mike writing this book. And I think it is successful in his aim. Okay, so is he this big villain? Well, no. Is he a poet for the ages? No. Are his lyrics perfect escapism? Yes. I mean, was he the great front man? Yes. So, but he needs product. He can run the store and sell it to you, but somebody has to make the product to put on the shelves, and that could only have been Brian Wilson. So it's an honest book. It's a good book. But Mike has been flint hard his whole life, and Mike hasn't pulled any punches. And Mike has blazed a unique trail. I'm going to follow the Maharishi. I'm still going to be involved in TM. This is going to be my life. I'm going to marry every woman. I'm going to marry 10 women. I'm not going to care what you say. I'm going to build a big home. I'm going to strut and sing or try to sing into my 80s, 80. I'm going to break records here. I'm going to own it and claim it. Some people are like, enough, Mike, stop. And a lot of people have this thing where they hug Brian Wilson to their bosom, and Mike Love is the fire to that water. And so they have the thing against Mike as well there. So Mike has won. Now, does he sit in his backyard and say, dang, people don't really like me because they think I'm so mean? I would say that eats at him. If he's a human being, that probably eats at him. This is my rep in the world, really? Even when I write this book, to help, I'm still Mike Love. There's websites devoted to how apparently mean he is. That's too broad a brushstroke. So are people kind of angry at him because he's a champion? I believe so. Probably. Sure. He's survived. He hasn't suffered like Brian has suffered. He hasn't, like you say, drunk in an alley somewhere. He's owning it. And that might rankle a bit too. People are always a bit jealous and why does he live so ostentatiously? Well, why wouldn't he? So it's funny. The Mike Love thing, I don't know. I feel like he gets a bit of a bum rap, but there's still things that paint him in a certain way, things that are true through history that you can't deny. But Mike maybe could get a break here and there, but not too much of a break.
Well, Gary, this has been absolutely fantastic to talk about these two books, and I'd thoroughly recommend everybody to get onto soulrideblog.com, navigate to the Beach Boys page. So, Gary, thank you for your fantastic work in writing those reviews, and thank you also for, once again, sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you, George, so much for this opportunity and for always being a good supporter of my work. It's much appreciated.
And that was a great fun episode to do. Really hope you enjoyed it as well. And we'll be back after the credits discussing The Minefield, that is the incursion by Charles Manson into the Beach Boys' professional and personal orbit. Podcast terms and conditions can be found at our website, DEC4podcast.com. You can contact us there or on our social media. Find us on the major podcasting platforms, and we're also on Substack, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram. This has been George Fairbrother. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Steve Collins from the YouTube channel Please Tell Me Where to Go. We have great travel videos and other stuff as well, so go to YouTube. Please tell me where to go. The 2 is the numeral 2, and enjoy a whole bunch of videos.
Talking about the connection between Charles Manson and the Beach Boys, especially Dennis, it's easy to just think it was a sort of a passing acquaintance. It was certainly more than that. Manson and his awful people moved themselves into Dennis Wilson's house, essentially took over. There was a creative collaboration. A Manson song, "Cease to Exist," was adapted and became "Never Learn Not to Love" off the 2020 album. Manson was mightily annoyed about this, about the fact that he had been excluded from the credit and that some of his words had been changed, to the point where he extorted a lot of money from Dennis and threatened to kidnap his son. And this was 6 months before the murders. Mike Love actually says that Dennis told him that Dennis witnessed a murder on Spahn Ranch. Charles Manson machine-gunned an African-American male and dumped his body into a well. So, Gary, just reflecting on perhaps the residual trauma of these events, do you think this could have been a major factor in how Dennis's life sadly unravelled?
I think you make a good point. I think that as people at the dawn of the 1970s began to fully fathom Manson's particular evil, but began to consider what was possible, the depths to which human beings could descend, it was unsettling for many, many people, I would say, particularly in the Hollywood community, when you consider that it came out later that there was a list of future victims that Tom Jones was on, Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, the statement kills that these animals wanted to make. And I also got to wonder if we, 50 years down the road, can really fully understand the evil, and maybe it needs time for perspective, but maybe it's worth noting that when this is currently happening to people, even though perhaps Manson is imprisoned, knowing that there's this capability out there must have been very unsettling. The whole hippie culture thing was turned on its head. Now a hippie on the sidewalk bumming a ride is a potential mass murderer. So people are unsettled, to say the least. So when you add that into, I stood next to him, I sensed his evil aura, and if Dennis actually saw him commit murder, I can see this really affecting a person negatively for many years to come. I can see a person adopting an attitude of, I better live now, party now, because there's evil out there. And not just random Joe getting murdered, but I've been so close to it that he could be instructing some minion and I could be gone, turn a corner and get knifed in the street. And I believe Dennis could have adopted that and thought, I'm going to live hard now because maybe I've dodged a bullet, literally and figuratively, but maybe I know it can be gone in an instant. And that could definitely inform the way you do life after that. For me, I gotta wonder if we have to go back to the Wilson family's legacy of pain, though. I'm wondering if that was already in Dennis's DNA. Being Murry Wilson's son, I don't know if Dennis was already destined to go down that road. Manson, his experience might have been the capper, might have pushed him over the edge, might have given him a little bit of an excuse in the back of my mind. Dennis, why are you living this way? Oh, Manson, I had an encounter with Manson. But I don't want to minimize it either. It could have definitely, to your point, had a major effect on the way he lived his life. It's part of this lattice work of things in Dennis's life that conspired against him. Definitely a big thing, too. So you make a good point.
Maybe even a sense of, and look, we are only speculating, of course, we don't know, but, Dennis certainly seemed to be a very nice person, a very sensitive person, perhaps even a sense of guilt that he might have looked back and thought, wow, could I have stopped that? Could I, if I'd spoken up, or, it's a very scary thing to do to speak up against someone like that, but, maybe a sense of guilt where he thought, gee, could I have done something to prevent this?
Yes, well, famously, that's what plagued Terry Melcher for years, is people died because of me. I discarded Charlie Manson as a potential musician, which set him off. So I know that Terry Melcher lived not only in fear, but guilt as well. So definitely, and, Dennis didn't say anything to anybody when he saw things or sensed things. Definitely that can plague you too. Innocent people were killed because, I let this guy go technically and didn't say anything. That's a good point too.
I mean, we're not judging, obviously, because, that was no. It would have been a big ask for someone to stand up to someone like that. Just finally too, just on the family aspect, one of the things I do love is the dynamic between the brothers. even when things weren't going well, Brian was helping Dennis with his music and Carl was helping Dennis with his music, and you can see the affection between the brothers on stage. And there's just a beautiful moment in Nebworth in 1980 when Brian is seated at the piano and Dennis just comes up behind and put his hands on his shoulders and kisses him on the head. And I just think that's just such a beautiful moment, actually. Maybe that was a bit of redemption from that legacy of pain, the love between the three brothers.
It's like any situation where you've been through something horrific with people, those people become really tight with you. So, the three of us survived Murry Wilson's home. Yeah, there's a connection there for sure.